We think we know what it means to own something. Your house, your car, the phone you're probably holding right now. But what if I told you that this idea, something that feels so fundamental, isn't some natural right? What if it's a concept that was invented, fought over, and reinvented for centuries? Well, today we're digging into the hidden theological roots of ownership. It's a wild story.
I mean, really think about it. When you say, "This is mine," what are you actually saying? Where does that claim get its power? Is it just something we all agree on? Is it a legal trick? Because this idea of absolute, personal property, something we take completely for granted, has a backstory that is way more complex and surprising than you'd think. So, to get to the bottom of this, we've got to go way back. And we're not starting with the founding of some modern country or the writing of a constitution. No, our story begins in the legal and intellectual world of ancient Rome, right as its massive empire was starting to crack and crumble. Okay, the one key idea we're going to be tracking today is this Roman concept called dominion. Now, this wasn't just about having something in your possession. This was a totally radical idea of absolute, abstract legal control. It was like having a little bubble of sovereignty over a thing, and the state would back you up. It gave you the right to use it, to enjoy it, and get this, even to destroy it. This was pure, unadulterated power, and it lifted the idea of ownership way above just social duty or practical use. So as Rome falls, its armies vanish, its aqueducts turn to ruin. But its legal ideas, they didn't just disappear. They found a new home, a powerful new guardian, the rising Christian church. The concept of dominium was, for all intents and purposes, baptized. It was absorbed into a whole new theological world that would give it a kind of sacred power it never, ever had before. And right away, this created a fascinating, almost impossible tension. On one side, you have these core early Christian values, community, sharing, being really suspicious of worldly wealth, apostolic poverty. And on the other side, you have this cold Roman legal concept of absolute individual control. I mean, these two things are in total opposition. How could an institution that preaches poverty justify a logic of total individual ownership? How do you square that circle? Well, the answer came from brilliant theologians like Thomas Aquinas. They came up with a genius solution. They essentially fused Roman law with Christian theology. They argued that, yeah, we have a moral duty to use our property for the common good, but the right to private ownership itself, that was part of God's natural law. And this, right here, was the critical shift. Dominium wasn't just a legal privilege anymore. It was sanctified. It was woven into the very fabric of God's plan for the world. Okay, so now that property has God's stamp of approval, it sets the stage for the next great power shift because a new player enters the game, the secular king. All these monarchs across Europe looked at the incredible authority the church had because of its land and its laws, and they thought, hey, I want a piece of that. And look, this transfer of power was a slow burn. It took centuries. After Rome fell, the church was basically the only game in town. It held on to Roman law, and it became Europe's biggest landlord, period. But by the High Middle Ages, you start to see these centralized monarchies getting stronger. They start competing directly with the Pope. And they've got a new weapon in their arsenal, the university, to help them build their own legal case for power. So here's the crucial point. The kings basically stole the church's playbook. You've heard of the divine right of kings, right? Well, that was pretty much a secular copy-paste of the church's sacred authority over its domain. The holiness that used to be attached to church property was now being applied to the king's territory. They didn't get rid of the sacred justification, they just moved it from the altar over to the throne. And the engine driving this whole transfer? It was the university. These brand new institutions were like intellectual factories working for the crown. Scholars there dug up old Roman law, they organized the church's own laws, and from that mix, they forged the modern legal tools of the state, things like legal title, jurisdiction, and sovereignty. They literally gave kings the intellectual firepower to turn just possessing land into formal, state-recognized, and legally defensible ownership. But you can't just keep consolidating power at the top like this, first with the church, then with kings, and expect everybody to just go along with it. A massive fracture was on the horizon, a rupture that was going to come from two directions at once, from inside the church with theological reformers, and from the ground up with popular rebellion. The Protestant Reformation was the earthquake. We usually think of it as a debate about faith and indulgences, but it was also a full frontal assault on the church's unbelievable wealth and property. The reformers directly challenged the idea that this institution, which had become the biggest landowner in all of Europe, had some kind of divine right to all that power. The sacred seal that had protected this fusion of property and theology for 1,000 years was suddenly and violently broken. And all this high-level theological crisis lit a real fire on the ground. The German Peasants' War was this massive, incredibly bloody uprising that was fueled by a perfect storm of grievances. You had centuries of just brutal feudal oppression crashing head-on into these radical new religious ideas from the Reformation, plus a deep, simmering anger over the loss of ancient common rights, the rights to use the forests, fields, and water that landlords had been slowly taking away for generations. And if you look at their manifesto, the 12 Articles, you see this wasn't just a random riot. This was a sophisticated political and religious argument. They demanded the end of serfdom. They wanted fair tithes based on the Bible. And crucially, they demanded the restoration of those communal land rights. They were fighting to bring back a vision of property that was rooted in community and scripture, not in the absolute power of lords. In the end, the peasants were brutally crushed. It's a tragic story, and the old sacred order was left in pieces. But the thing that replaced it wasn't the communal vision the peasants fought for. Not at all. Instead, the collapse of this divine justification for ownership paved the way for brand new, totally secular logic, one that would come to define our entire modern world. And this is a fundamental 180-degree shift in how people thought about ownership. The old logic was all about divine right and inheritance. You own land because God and your family tree said you did. The new logic, it's all about productivity and improvement. You own land because you make it profitable. Legitimacy doesn't come from some sacred order anymore. It comes from enterprise and profit. This is basically the birth of a capitalist idea of property. So let's just step back and recap the incredible journey this one idea has been on. It starts in Rome as dominium, this idea of absolute control. Then it gets baptized by the church and turned into a kind of divinely ordered stewardship. Then it gets co-opted by the crown and becomes a tool of secular royal power. And finally, in the modern era, it gets rationalized all over again as an ideology of productivity and profit. What a ride.
And here's the real kicker. The justification for ownership had been completely reinvented. But for a lot of people, the outcome was exactly the same. The consolidation of property, the enclosure of common lands, that all just kept going, maybe even faster than before. Only now, it wasn't being done in the name of God or the king. It was being done in the name of improvement and progress.
And that brings us right here to our final, lingering question. We've seen how this idea of ownership, something that feels so solid and permanent, has actually been twisted and transformed multiple times throughout history to serve whoever was in power. It was constructed, then deconstructed, and then reconstructed all over again. Which leaves us with a pretty provocative thought, doesn't it? If this idea was reinvented before, could it be reinvented again?